This is North Pod, a North Melbourne fan podcast, hosted by Jason Hunt.
Stevenson with his own move. Carrington. North are in front.
Hello and welcome back once again to North Pod. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm coming to you soon after the Brownlow, so this episode we're going to talk a little bit about the Brownlow, not spend too much on it. We know that it's not an award that we're going to find ourselves in the running for in the short term, but we'll run through that. And then for the most part of this episode, we are going to focus on rating the midfield performances from our North Melbourne men's side. So we'll get to that second, but we will start with the Brownlow first up. We're going to focus mostly on North Melbourne. So if you didn't tune in, it was a very, very quiet count for us right up until the midway point. Harry Sheez was putting in the work early in the year. And besides him, we did not have anyone poll right up until the bye. So Sheez polled 2 votes in round 2 against Freo. I think we all remember that game where, personally, I was there and I thought, here we go. This is the start of something. And then halftime came and it all fell apart. So he got 2 votes in that game in round 10 then. So going all the way to round 10, he got 1 vote against Essendon. And he also got 1 vote the next week in round 11 against Port. So at the halfway mark of our season, Harry Sheez 4 votes, and that was it. Oh boy, as BT would say, that was not looking good. After the bye, we know that our form as a side did improve. And as a result, we did get some more votes. So our final standings was Luke Davies-Uniacke actually came out on top on 18 votes, which I think, LDU 18 and Harry Sheez 15. So both of those are fantastic performances considering the fact that we won 3 matches for the year. It then does drop off dramatically after that. Nick Larkey 3 votes, George Wardlaw 2, and then single votes to McKercher, Simpkin, Sherry and Zerha. So not dissimilar from the North Podium voting, from the best and fairest voting. We all know that those 2 and Sherry had elite years. I thought Tristan was pretty hard done by to only get the 1 vote, but look, the umpires probably weren't necessarily noticing him in his first full season of footy. Yeah, I would expect that next year, if his form continues, he'll see some more voting. I guess just on that, I know every year the Brownlow happens and we get into this debate about whether or not the umpires should be voting and how did X player not get a vote in this game? And, I get it, but I think ultimately we just have to accept that the Brownlow is what it is. That's my opinion at least. Like, the umpires vote on it, we all acknowledge that they're going to get things wrong, and that's okay because their primary job is to umpire the game. Could they then have a look at some vision or some stats afterwards? Look, potentially, but I think the award is what it is. And then because a lot of times people say, well, I think we should value the Players Association or the Coaches Association votes more. Well, go ahead and do that. Like, I think ultimately the Brownlow is, it's about the red carpet. It's about the prestige and the event itself. But, we can place whatever value we like as a consumer or as the footy public on the award. And I think, it's a great award. We all know that it's something that's highly coveted, but I think it's okay to acknowledge that the voting system doesn't necessarily always result in the best player winning. There's plenty of examples of that. And we also know that just by virtue of the way it's voted, like if you're a really good player in an okay side that wins lots of games, as opposed to, one of several really good players, you're a much better chance of winning. That's historically been the case. It just makes sense. There's only 3 opportunities each game to get some votes. So the fact that LDU and Sheez have done as well as they have, I think, speaks to the fact that they do stand out and that they're players that the umpires recognised and noticed. Yeah, LDU in particular, after the bye, had 5 best on ground performances. So against the Eagles in round 13, the Pies round 14, Melbourne round 15, Gold Coast round 17. So he was best on ground 4 out of 5 games there, according to the umpires. And then again, round 21 against the Tigers in that win, also best on ground. So 15 of his 18 votes came from best on ground performances, and he's picked up a 2 and a 1 elsewhere to make the 18. So for our side, total 42 votes. The maximum's 138 for your team if you were to get 3-2-1 for every match. And ironically, the winner of the Brownlow, Paddy Cripps, I'll talk about in a minute, had more votes than our entire team combined, which, is a little bit embarrassing, but also I think the fact that he voted, it's ridiculous how highly he voted. It's a crazy, crazy year. And I feel like every year we're breaking records with the Brownlow. Part of that is we're playing an extra game. That helps, but by golly, to finish on 45 votes, I guess that's the last thing to talk about there. So Paddy Cripps won on 45 votes, and he is the quintessential, fantastic player and a solid side. Obviously, Sammy Walsh took some votes off him, but by and large, Paddy Cripps is the player in that side, and I think that's the reason he's able to poll 45 votes. Nick Dacos would have won it any other year on 38 votes, so he's if we strike through Paddy Cripps, Nick Dacos is the highest vote getter ever, so it's a crazy year for those two. They were the hot favourites going in. There were some interesting non-pollers, like Bontempelli was really, really hard done by, I thought, ended up on maybe 17 or 19, but certainly a low number for him. Lachie Neale didn't really do the damage that he has in the past. He still ended up, I think, on 22, but was never looking like it. He got some votes late to push himself up there. So yeah, after Dacos, Zach Butters 29, Caleb Sarong and Isaac Heaney 28, but we know Heaney was ineligible, and early on he was out to a big lead, Isaac Heaney, but then quietened down. Tom Green, who I was barracking for, I love Tom Green, he was on 27. Adam Treloar was the one stealing a lot of votes off the Bont, and I think Treloar is that perfect standout player for a Brownlow. He's an outside gun, and they're often easier to notice. He had 26 votes. And then Goulden, 25, Matt Rowell, 25, Jai Newcomb, 24, rounds out the top several. And we saw, as I was alluding to earlier, that Sydney was that perfect example of what it can look like when you've got a group of elite players, because Heaney, Goulden and Chad Warner were all up the top there on more than 20 votes. So obviously, stealing votes from each other, so to speak, whereas Cripps didn't have that competition. He had Sammy Walsh taking a couple of votes, and then beyond that, it really dropped off. So, yeah, I mean, as per usual, it's a midfielders award. We can see Cripps midfielder, Dacos midfielder, Butters midfielder, Sarong midfielder, Green, Treloar, Goulden, Rowell, Newcomb are all mids, and then Isaac Heaney is a forward who can also play through the midfield. So, look, we know that, and I think all of the complaints that people make about it, we just have to acknowledge that this is what it is. So, look, I think after a really, really, really slow start to North Melbourne's voting, I think to have LDU and Sheez acknowledged, so to speak, that highly is fantastic. I think we know that both of those are within a shot of winning a Brownlow if North Melbourne ever gets good, which we certainly are hoping for. The other North Melbourne thing that happened on the night was Mark of the Year. Zane Dursman was in the running. I think probably ultimately Bobby Hill's mark was the best for the year, and he won it. So power to him. Jamie Elliott was the other nominee, but yeah, Bobby Hill won that one. Zane Dursman, I think, fantastic that he got a nomination, but I don't think he was going to win a popular vote. And yeah, I do believe, unfortunately, Bobby Hill's mark was on top of Jackson Archer. It was a really good mark though, so hard to argue with that. That was our night. It was great to see the lads there having a good time. And I mean, yeah, look, Brownlow night is what it is. I think it's just another example of, so long as we understand what the award is doing and how it's voted on, I think we can be comfortable with it. Actually, as I'm recording this, I remember that my last over-under I had to check was Harry Sheez Brownlow vote. So let me just go check that. So my over-under was Harry Sheez, and I predicted this before the season started. Harry Sheez receives 9.5 Brownlow votes. I took the under, and as we know, he ended up polling 15 votes. So he has most certainly taken the over on that one. I thought probably, I mean, he got 3 votes last year. I thought we weren't going to win many games. I thought probably he'd end up with, 6, 7, 8, 9 votes, something like that. So, yeah, great that he was able to have some success in the Brownlow. And like I said, I think that is one that we can look forward to him polling really well in the future if things continue the way that we hope that they will. So that'll do us for the Brownlow chat. Not a lot there for us to talk about because we know that we're not going to poll well, and that's what happened. Let's get into the bulk of the episode, which is where we are going to rank the midfielders' seasons. So if you listened to the equivalent episode for the defenders last week, you know the gist. I'm giving each player a score from 0 to 10. I'm trying to be as objective as possible, but we know that's, it's an opinions game, and so ultimately these are opinions based on me synthesizing the facts, I guess. 10 is a 100% exceptional, near-perfect season. 5 is just a bang average season as an AFL footballer. And 0 is either an absolutely horrible year or you just didn't play football. I'm trying to score it without any expectation on the table. And I'm also trying to score it just from the perspective of what their impact was on the AFL football field. There's going to be some imperfections to it, so I put all of that on the table. It's not going to be perfect, but that's the gist of what we're going for, and you can absolutely fight me on it in the comments or on social media, or let's debate it. I'm so happy to have a debate about several of these players. And so, this episode is dedicated to the midfielders. There's probably one or two here that are questionably midfielders, but like I mentioned last episode, I've just split them into 15 groups, or groups of 15, so that it works relatively evenly. We'll put them all together at the end and we can kind of see what it looks like. And we're going to go through in jumper number order. So Harry Sheezel first up. We were just talking about him in the Brownlow. Harry Sheezel, 21 games, 29.8 disposals on average, 6.3 marks, 3.8 tackles, 3.5 clearances, kicked 14 goals for the year. And I mean, look, I can keep reeling off the numbers if you like, but I think we all know this was another phenomenal year from Sheez. Started the year in defence like he played last year, and then moved into more of a forward/midfield role around round 8. Probably more time in the midfield, but definitely did go forward, and that 14 goals that he kicked reflected that. Took a game or two to adjust, and then from then on was just immense like he always is. Impactful, found plenty of the footy. Like I said, 29.8 disposals. He just, he got leather poisoning regularly. Won my North Podium Award for the best player according to me, so you'd think I'm going to score him pretty highly. Polled in 16 of his 21 games when I was voting. 6 best on grounds or best North Melbourne players. We saw that he finished 3rd in the Sid Barker, so we know that he's obviously valued by the coaching group as well. When he does go forward, uber accurate, 14 goals won. I'm sure he had 1 or 2 out on the full or that didn't make it, but still very accurate kicking to only kick 1 behind and 14 goals. And honestly just showed that wherever he plays, he's our cleanest, most composed player. And he still hasn't even played 50 games. It's just a remarkable first 2 seasons from Harry Sheezel. Truly special, to be honest, to be playing as well as he has been in, what's been a really awful team for the last couple of years. I gave him a 10 last year. I honestly think that he's improved. So it has to be a 10 again. He's amazing, Harry Sheezel. It's been a phenomenal year. Yep, he missed those last 2 games with injury, and he had some quieter games as he adjusted to that midfield role. But I mean, that's such nitpicking stuff. He wasn't bad in any game really. A 10. It's got to be a 10 for Sheez. We move from Harry Sheezel to a player who is certainly towards the other end of the spectrum, Curtis Taylor. 8 games, averaged 10.8 disposals, 3.8 marks, 2.3 tackles, kicked 3 goals for the year, and has been delisted. So I guess we'll put that on the table. Obviously not a great year, and a bit of a disappointing way for him to round out his North Melbourne career for Curtis Taylor. Showed so much promise early on. His 2022 season was very solid, and I thought he played some great footy during the pandemic. I can distinctly remember watching him on my couch during lockdown thinking, great, we've got a player here. He looks talented. But played VFL to start the year, came in at around round 10 and played through to round 18. Had a pretty solid game against Collingwood, 22 disposals, 6 tackles, kicked a goal. But besides that performance this year, just hasn't come on. In the last 2 years, unfortunately, he's found it really hard to find a spot in the side. There wasn't a spot for him in the half-forward line. There wasn't really a spot for him on the wing. And like I said, just disappointing because he does have that raw talent. There's every chance that he gets picked up as a delisted free agent elsewhere. It felt like we kind of gave him that block in the middle of the year to show if he's got anything to give for the future, and he obviously didn't show enough and wasn't able to show enough consistently. So, finishes up with us with 76 games, 33 goals. And, you get the sense that there's probably a club out there that identifies him as, a low risk, let's pick him up as insurance, and then who knows what he could become. There's every chance that happens, but unfortunately he didn't have the attributes with the players in our side to make it work. So In terms of his season, I think it's probably a 3. He played some footy, but was mostly ineffectual. Like I can't think of a game beyond that Collingwood one where he had a super positive impact. Unfortunately, finished the year with injury as well, so was unable to, push his case in the last couple of games. But I mean, yeah, he got delisted, so it has to be a 3. A disappointing year for Curtis Taylor, a disappointing way for him to finish up. But, if we want our list to get better, we've got to move on from players like him, so I think it makes sense. Georgie Wardlaw, number 6, everyone's favourite draftee that's not named Harry Sheezel from last year. 18 games, averaged 19.1 disposals, 3.3 marks, 4.3 tackles, 4.8 clearances. And scoring his year was interesting because I think he probably comes in with a bit of expectation, and sometimes it can be difficult to separate that expectation from how good his year was. I think it was really positive that we got through the season with his hamstrings intact, which we know was an issue last year. Unfortunately, though, did have a few head knocks, so hopefully he can put those behind him next year. Hopefully he doesn't cop another head knock soon, because we know that those players that cop repeated head knocks can, it can become problematic for them in terms of their playing career, but also their life. So we don't want that at all. Had a massive game, similar to Curtis Taylor, had a really big game against Collingwood, 30 disposals, kicked a goal, 6 clearances. Had another really good game against the Saints, one of the times we played them. But I thought just had, a year that he didn't necessarily explode and show the whole footy world what he can be. It's around that consistency within games, I think. Still finished second in the Rising Star Award, so he did have a good year. Like I said, I just think it's that consistency, because he goes in and out of games, and he did come in with a lot of expectation because we saw, little bits of brilliance last year. His effort can't be questioned. I just think it's around, picking up his effectiveness by foot. I think he could probably improve a little bit in that area, and just closing the gap between his best and his worst. Because there were games where you just thought, I only saw a couple of George Wardlaw moments. We love George Wardlaw. He's only played 20-odd games now, or 25-odd games. So there's still so much development for him. And he's still a pretty slight player for an inside mid. He needs to put some weight on and hopefully doesn't lose too much of that power through his legs. So yeah, I think he was a 5 last year. He played more footy this year and was better. But I think because it was less of a surprise to us this year, or to the footy public, there was probably a little bit less fanfare around it. I think it has to be a 6. And so, to put that in perspective, I do think he had a better than average year, but only just. And the average is, an average AFL footballer, not an average George Wardlaw year, whatever that means, given it's his second year. So, yeah, I think a 6 for Georgie is fair. Like to see some more development from him next year, but it's another solid building block in terms of fitness if we can put those head knocks aside, which hopefully we can. I mean, that being said, the challenge with a player like him is the way that he plays, he's going to put his head in dangerous spots. So hopefully a bit of technique can sort that out, and a bit of luck, and he can get off to a really big year next year. Bailey Scott is the next one. A really interesting one to mark. 23 games, played every game, averaged 20.3 disposals, which is approximately 2 less than he did last year. 5 marks. And I think the big thing for him was a lot less running bounces this year than last year. He had 18 last year, so nearly 1 per game. He had 4 this year, so a lot less of that run and carry that, I think should be a benchmark or a hallmark of his game, rather. His impact this year was definitely less than it has been in previous years. Coming off the 2 podiums in the Sid Barker the last couple of years, there was that level of expectation, and I think, in part he failed in terms of living up to that expectation, but also he was played off halfback for a fair bit, and for me it just didn't work. So we did see him play halfback and wing. There was a really solid split there, and as a result of that, some of his numbers in terms of intercepting and rebound 50s were higher this year. But yeah, like I mentioned, his effectiveness and his ability to impact games was definitely lessened this year. I think if we just forget expectations, he had an average year. 5 feels about right. He got a little bit better as the year went on. I think probably early on he was more in that 4 range. And then as he played more of that wing role, I think he improved. So that did bring him up to a 5 for me. I think he's at his best when he's played on the wing, he's kicking long, he's running down the wing, and he's linking up via handball. That is the Bailey Scott that I'd like to see him get back to next year. When his first priority is defending, I just don't think he's able to bring enough of those attributes. And his kicking isn't precise enough to play in the role of McKercher or Sheez in that really deep defensive role. So yeah, I definitely would like to see him played on the wing. I think a 5 is a fair. It was an average season for him. Definitely an unremarkable AFL year for Bailey Scott. A step back from his previous couple of seasons, but like I said, I think he was played a little bit out of position. So hopefully we can get back to him playing mostly on the wing next year and we can see his best footy. LDU is next up, and this is probably one that I might get some complaints or some disagreement about. And like I said off the top, I totally take that on board. It's an opinions game. So LDU played every game, and he averaged 27.7 disposals, 3.7 marks, essentially 4 tackles, 6.3 clearances, and kicked 11 goals, which was the most for his career. Essentially kicked a goal every second game. His game, obviously an amazing year. We talked about him during the Brownlow chat. He was our highest polling Brownlow getter this year. Played some amazing footy. His game against Richmond was the quintessential LDU game. 33 disposals, 3 goals, 8 clearances, 3 goal assists. If you got 5 or 6 of those games a year, we'd be set. That was a phenomenal game statistically by him. We saw parts of that brilliance across the whole year. He played his 100th game. He remained fit and firing. He had less interruptions or no interruptions because he didn't miss a game. Obviously he had an amazing year. I think the one nitpick on him at times, or actually 2, at times his defensive work was questioned, and that was particularly early on in the year. There were times where I just think he needed to chase harder, he needed to tackle harder. There were moments within games where he let himself down with his defensive work, and I totally take on board that if you are the best midfielder in the side and you need to be focusing on the offensive end, that there's going to be a bit of give and take there. If we think about the best midfielders, from the time that I've been playing football, been watching football rather, most of them are offensive beasts that can do a bit of defending, but it's not necessarily their number one focus. So I take all of that on board. The other thing that I think lets him down a little bit is his body language at times. There were times in games where things weren't going well, where he was visibly frustrated with teammates and really dropped his head. And I think that's the difference between him being a 10 and where I've put him at a 9, because, he's in that age bracket where he is our best, out and out midfielder. He's the leader, and he's in that age bracket where he needs to be setting or leading by example. And I think most of the time he did that. But there were just times where I was a little bit disappointed with his body language and, like I said, his defensive work. By and large, he had an amazing year. So a 9 is still an absolutely tremendous year. I just think there are a couple of things that I would have liked, or that I think he could have done better, that would have moved him towards a 10 for me. Totally understand he won the best and fairest. The coaching group obviously saw him as the best player for the year. I take that on board. He was 3rd for me in the North Podium. And so I guess that's probably where my opinion's a little bit different. But again, an amazing year. I just want to see him consistently bring all of what he can do offensively, and then next year just add a little bit more defensive craft. That's all. It's not a lot. It's just a little bit, and consistently lead with that positive attitude. But an amazing year from LDU. We saw so many times him bursting away from stoppage. We saw he's very quick-footed. His change of direction can be great. Sometimes he gets caught trying to do too much, but I don't really think that's a slight on him. I think that's the rest of the mids sort of letting him down at times and him having to do more. So a tremendous year, a 9 for me. But look, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because I acknowledge that there'll be most people that probably think his season was a 10, and his polling at the Brownlow and the BNF does reflect that. Jai Simpkin is a different one. 18 games, 21 disposals, 3 tackles, 4 clearances, 11 goals for the year. Those were averages, obviously, but up until the goals. 11 goals a game on average would be great from Jai. The Webster hit in the preseason really seemed to shake him. He was going to be playing a different role anyway, with more of a half-forward role, and he did do that in the first part of the year once he came back from the concussion. Grew into the season as he got more midfield time, I thought, but ultimately really found himself in our best I thought personally he had 2 best on ground performances, one in the West Coast win, and then the last game of the year against the Hawks, I thought he was our best. And that's it. I think, he wasn't in our best 5 or 6 any other time throughout the year, which is, a bit of a concern for a midfielder that's, our captain. His kicking lets him down at times. He was guilty of trying to do too much at times as well, like I mentioned with LDU. And so, I think he kind of had a bit of an average year. I thought his year got better the more time he spent in the midfield. And as the year went on, he was spending more time in the midfield because, things changed around in our midfield dynamic and there was a bit more room for him. I do wonder if potentially there's a role on a wing for him and if that might be a better fit. He's really fit. We know that he's always up there in the time trials. It would allow him to play a similar role to that of Bailey Scott in previous years, where you're not necessarily focused on precise kicking, but you can run and carry and you can kick it long. I think that's something that Jai can do. I have absolutely no intel on whether or not that's going to happen for what it's worth. It's just when I watch him play at the moment, that's kind of what I think. He was a 5 last year, and I think that's about right. I think he's a 5 again. He was never a legitimate chance to be dropped, but he was, like I said, very rarely in our best. So I think needs a big year next year and just to consolidate on his captaincy and his form, because there's been some issues in those areas for him, unfortunately. Liam Shields is next up. He's an interesting one to score. 17 games, 12 disposals, 2.5 marks, 2.7 tackles, kicked 4 goals for the year. In fact, played 1 more game than he did last year, which, was a little bit surprising. I think we were expecting him to tail off a little bit more than he did. Did play 3 as the sub and was subbed off once, so 13 full games for Liam Shields. Early on, looked past it. Was sloppy, was fumbly, was slow. In the first couple of games that he played, I was really concerned that if that was going to be his form all year, that we wouldn't be able to pick him, because last year in 2023, I thought, his cleanness and his hardness, his toughness was fantastic. I thought there was so many positives that he brought last year. At the start of this year, I was concerned. I think as the season went on, he became a bit more reliable. He was able to be a bit of a gap filler, played a little bit of time on the wing. You could kind of slot him into different spots on the ground for small periods of time and make it work. Sometimes that was a half-forward role. Times that might have been off half-back, but mostly through the middle part of the ground without going into too many centre bounces. I think we very rarely saw him in there this year. I think for me, he's probably retiring 1 year too late from an on-ground perspective, but all the talk is that he was a fantastic influence behind the scenes and, at the club. So I think that's the sort of thing that's a bit hard to mark him on or from the outside for us to understand, but you have to trust the word that comes out that he was doing some fantastic work in those areas. So, I take that on face value. I think he got a 6 last year, but it was definitely not as impactful on the ground this year as he was last year. I was tossing up between a 3 or a 4, and I think I've edged him up to a 4 because there were, particularly in the second part of the year, there were some moments where he created something out of, not nothing, but he did the right thing from using his footy smarts from, his 200, 300 games of experience. He was able to create something. So I think for those moments where we really needed a player with his maturity and his smarts, that gets him up to a 4. Unfortunately, those moments were pretty few and far between, but he played 17 games. Like I said, he played a lot of footy, and I think the role that he played at times was important, even though, it's not a very sexy role, I suppose is what you would say. It's not a super attractive role that he's playing. Dylan Stephens this is a tough one. 16 games for Dill Stephens, averaged 12.8 disposals, 2.7 marks, and, was supposed to be the solution to our other wing. Bailey Scott on one wing and Dylan Stephens on the other. And, neither of those things happened at the start of the year. Dylan Stephens was playing on the wing, but he certainly was not a solution. Only cracked 20 disposals twice, and that was with a 20 and a 21. So, whilst you don't need your wingman picking up 35 every week, I think you'd like to see your wingman picking up 20 more regularly than that. Just goes missing or went missing for large chunks of games. And in part, I think, is a victim of big expectations. Coming across from Sydney on a 5-year deal, we know that we're paying him for another 4 years. Early on in the year, I thought he had a couple of moments where he really needed to go hard and put his body on the line, and he didn't. And at times he became a little bit of a whipping boy or a scapegoat for North fans, and I understood why, because there were those moments within games that were very easy for outsiders to point to and go, gee, he missed it there. He didn't play the right way that he should have. Missed from round 8 to round 14 and then came back in and had several sub roles later in the year. Is going to need to find more of the ball next year. I think that's pretty obvious. He just was not able to get himself into positions to help transition the footy well enough. I think given the fact that we've given him a long deal, he's got 4 more years, I would expect to see us continue to experiment with him and to try and find a role that works for him. He's now played 59 games. He's 23 years old. He should be on the improve and should be becoming a player for us, in theory, on paper. But that definitely remains to be seen. So it was a disappointing year from Dill. I'm giving him a 3. I think, output-wise, pretty similar year to Liam Shields, but I don't really think had those moments to elevate him up to a 4. I thought he was disappointing and really didn't impact much in terms of the way that games went. So, yeah, disappointing from Dill. It has to be a 3 from me. Then we've got a couple of players here that I'll be able to whip through pretty quickly because they didn't play. So Taylor Goad is one. He spent the year in the VFL, often not even as the ruckman, which is where we've drafted him or what role we've drafted him for. He'll get time to develop. He's 207 centimetres, 20th pick in last year's draft. So I would expect a similar year for him next year, unless there's really significant injuries at AFL level. He spent time in the VFL at fullback. He was doing some weird things at VFL level, but I think it's a long-term prospect for Taylor Goad. So, I mean, yeah, it's a 0 because he had 0 on-field impact, and I that's not really a slight on him. It's just where he's at. And then Geordie Payne's another one who didn't play. We only picked him up mid-year, so he only had half a year to potentially push for a game. I think I've graded him here in the midfield because in theory he's kind of a midfielder forward. He was also played off half back as well, so that's before he was drafted. I think probably he's a better fit in the forward line for us long term. I think that's where there's a chance for him to get a game, and that's most of where he was playing at VFL level. Played some okay footy at VFL level, but he didn't set things alight. He wasn't able to push for a spot, and I don't think that was the expectation for this year. He will be fighting for a spot for a small forward role next year with players like Robert Hansen Jr. So there's every chance that he gets a game next year, full pre-season, proper integration into our systems, and hopefully he can take a step. And there'll be a spot up for grabs. It's just whether or not he's able to grab it. So similar to Taylor Goad, it has to be a 0 just based on on-field impact. Then we can move to a couple of players who we had big raps coming into the year. So Tommy Powell first. Played every game, which did surprise me, just sort of crept up on me a little bit. Averaged 20.1 disposals, 3.7 marks, 4.2 tackles, 4 clearances, kicked 9 goals. Started like a house on fire, did Tommy Powell. Cooled off a little bit in the middle part of the year, but had some big games. 28 disposals and 2 goals against Freo, 29 disposals and a goal against Carlton. So really set it alight to start off the year and solidified his spot as a midfielder who can also rest forward at times and is actually dangerous forward of the ball. Really didn't look like getting dropped all year, Tommy Powell, but does have some games where he was a bit more quiet. Going into the year, it was, who of Powell and Lazaro and Wilfield's going to take that next step and lock their spot in the side. And it was Tommy Powell. He was, miles ahead of those two come the end of the year, but it did seem neck and neck at the start. I thought he provided great spread from stoppage. He had great hands, which we've seen from him in his first season. He's got a great hand pass. Just like I said, needs to stamp those quiet games, out of his game. He had 10 disposals against the Crows, 12 against Collingwood, 11 against Carlton the second time we played them, 8 disposals against the Hawks. So he can sometimes go missing and have a quiet game. That's what's going to, elevate his game to the next level, I think. The ability to play more consistently game to game. But a really, really good year from Tommy Powell. Had a top 5 finish in the Sid Barker, which, reflects the strength of his year. I was tossing up between a 6 and a 7, but I think a 7 is fair because there were no games where it was impacting us negatively. There was just games where he was there, and there was games where he was a really positive influence. So I think a better than average year for Tommy Powell, a 7 for him. And again, if you think that he was better or worse than that, I'd love to hear why. Wilfield is next, and like I mentioned before, he came into the year with potentially big raps and potentially a massive year for him. Only managed 11 games, so approximately half. Averaged 14 disposals, 5 tackles, and 2.3 clearances. Missed the start, was playing in the VFL to start the year, came in for a few in the middle part, and then more or less finished the year off. Played some great but overblown shutdown roles on Dacos and Oliver in consecutive weeks. You could argue that subbing him off in that third quarter against the Pies lost us that game. Apparently he was absolutely gassed and couldn't go on, but he essentially nullified Dacos in those first 3 quarters, and then Dacos really got off the chain in the last quarter and played a big part in Collingwood winning that game. And then the next week we came up against Melbourne and he shut out Clayton Oliver and absolutely blanketed him. That being said, Clayton Oliver, did not have a good season. So, I think he did those 2 really good roles, and all of a sudden people were talking him up as though he's the next great tagger. He was thoroughly beaten by Bontempelli and Treloar. I don't remember if it was the next week, but certainly soon after. And I think, there's limitations to the sort of run-with role that he can play. But I think, ultimately you'd like to think that a pick 3 is going to become a good midfielder without having to tag. That remains to be seen. He only topped 20 disposals once, which was the second game against Geelong. His smaller frame has made it hard for him to have significant impact. I think it's irrefutable that, if you're as small as he is, you've got to have some really strong attributes. And whilst I think he's a great kick inside 50, he just doesn't find enough of the footy. He's a super unselfish handballer. Sometimes I'd like him to be a little bit more selfish. And another issue, I suppose, is that he really isn't able to play anywhere other than the midfield. He's not super dangerous forward. I can't see him playing off half back. So, there are a lot of limitations to where you can play him and how he plays. I think potentially in the mid-season, in the pre-season, you look at, training him up as a run-with player and see if that's a role that he can play intentionally rather than as a bit of a makeshift stopper like he was this year. Hard to score, but I've gone with a 3. I was tossing up between a 3 or a 4. I think a 3.5 would be fairest, but I'm going to go with a 3. I just think he didn't play a lot of footy, and the footy that he played, although he had a couple of good performances, there was also not a lot around that, so not a lot of substance. So you certainly couldn't say that he had a good year. I think a 3 for Wilfield is fair. I've got 3 left here to go through. Charlie Lazaro is the other of that trio that I was talking about. 9 games. Only 3 of them full games. He had a lot either as the sub or being subbed off. And I suppose that is partially reflected in his numbers. Averaged 11 disposals, 2.1 tackles, 1.1 clearances. So didn't bring a lot at AFL level. Similar to Wilfield, he can only really play a midfield role. And he doesn't do that well enough at AFL level to justify his spot in the side at the moment. Probably doesn't have the same upside as Wilfield. I think, if Wilfield could put together, he's probably a better player than Charlie Lazaro is at AFL level at their best. Finds plenty of the ball at VFL level, but just can't replicate that with less midfield time, unfortunately. Didn't get more than 16 touches once. I think he got a pretty decent run at to start the year. So I can't point to a single moment where he had a positive, memorable impact on the game. So that says to me that he's probably going to find himself on the AFL scrap heap, unfortunately. All reports he's a fantastic bloke. He is still on our list. We haven't delisted him at this point. He's one of 3 uncontracted players going into the trade period, so he's going to have to bide his time a little bit to see if there's a spot still left for him. But yeah, I think it's irrefutable that he didn't have a good year. A touchdown from Wilfield, so I've given Lazaro a 2 because his impact at AFL level was pretty minimal. I think he's the sort of player that unfortunately we might just have to cut our losses on and try and start again with someone else at the draft. And then we've got 2 of our ruckmans. Tristan Xerri is first, and boy, played every game, 18 disposals, 6.6 clearances, 7.5 tackles. There's more numbers where I'm not done yet. 34.5 hit-outs, 8.7 of those to advantage. Averaged 3 marks, nearly 1 contested mark per game. Went forward and kicked 8 handy goals. What can you say? Got a full season at it as the sole ruckman without injury, and he absolutely dominated. And I think there were a lot of knocks or lots of people that didn't believe in him. I certainly did not believe that he could be this good. I did not see this coming, but I did think that we need to give him a proper shot at it. He never got a proper shot at it, either through injury or having to kind of share the role with Goldie, which, I just don't think worked for him. So amazing work from Tristan Sherry. I thought his marking, which has been a knock on him, got better as the season went on. He regularly topped the side for clearances and the tackle count. So, he's such a physical player, and he talked about the best and fairest. Like, he enjoys hurting players, and he's kind of got permission from the coaches to go about the game that way, in that highly contested manner. I think that he kind of knows his role when he's got the ball. He's happy to give the hands off to designated kickers. He can kick long when he has to, and he's often part of sort of link up chains through the middle of the ground via hand as well. He's pretty good at assessing the options and shooting a hand pass out to someone on the way past, or receiving a forward hand pass and giving the 1-2 back. I think he was pretty unlucky to miss out on the All-Australian, but look, it doesn't matter. He had such a fantastic year. I think we just have to be so grateful that we've moved Goldie on and immediately have found his replacement, who's just been, biding his time for the most part in the VFL for the last several years. So many physical tussles that stick out from across the year. He crunched countless players, and he's just a great bloke to top it all off. So I think we've locked him in for the foreseeable future. The season that he had, finished second on the North Podium for me, second in the Sid Barker, and for me it's a 10. It's a 10 of a season. As a ruckman, I think we could have expected nothing more from him. It was the perfect year for a ruckman. So a 10 for Tristan Sherry. I just cannot believe the player that he's turned into, and I'm just so grateful that we have a ruckman like him, because it did look like that was going to be an issue for us going into the year. And then finally, this will be a quicker one. Hamish Free was our backup ruck that plugged away in the VFL. Never really looked like getting a game at AFL level and has been delisted, but you do need players like him for security on the list. I guess the thinking now is that we've got Taylor Goad with a year under his belt in the VFL, and so he can kind of be that Taylor Goad, that Hamish Free role now, where if we absolutely had a bit of a decimated ruck stocks, then we could play him. So, got to be a 0 for Hamish Free. No AFL impact for me, and has been delisted. So unfortunately, that's just the way it goes. And that wraps up the midfield review. So I'll quickly go over those numbers again, just so you can get a sense for them in order here. Scoring a 0 is Hamish Free, Geordie Payne and Taylor Goad. Obviously, no games from any of them, so no AFL impact. Didn't score anyone a 1. Charlie Lazaro got a 2. At 3, Curtis Taylor and Will Phillips. 4, Dylan Stevens and Liam Shields. And then we move into the players that were either average or had good years. So Bailey Scott and Jai Skimkin at 5. Disappointing years from both of those. Hopefully we can score them above a 5 next year. Georgie Wardlaw a 6. Tommy Powell a 7. So great to see those young midfielders settling above what I would call an average year. And then we have our 3 superstars. LDU a 9. Save me the emails. But honestly, I take the feedback on. I'd love to chat about it. Tristan Sherry and Harry Sheezel 10s. I think for their positions, what they were asked to do, I think they had near perfect years. So that is the midfielders. Next podcast, we'll be having a look at the forwards, and that'll round out our areas of the ground, and we can kind of have a look at the whole spread together. So I look forward to doing that in the next week or so. There's obviously plenty of AFLW action as well. The girls got several games in a short period of time here around grand final time. So there'll still be more AFLW content coming down the pipe as well. The AFL season is about to wrap up. Grand final coming up this weekend. So that the trade season, the free agency period is about to open up. So we'll certainly have some podcasts in future weeks looking at, what's happening and how we're improving our list, all of those things. I look forward to talking about that with you all. But for now, that is going to do us for the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate all of the feedback and all the interaction I've had with the fans over the last couple of weeks. It's been great. A cheeky reminder, if you would like to support the show in an additional way, you can find my Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes for the podcast. It's just another way to show your appreciation, and I do appreciate all of the people that have done so across the season. And as I always say, go North. Thanks for listening to another episode of NorthPod. If you give me a rating or review on your podcast service, that would be much appreciated. And please follow me on all social media at NorthPod Show. I'm on X or Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and I'm also very active on the North Melbourne subreddit. Hope you'll join me for the next episode.